Hello and welcome to History Behind the Page, the live series where you get to know more about the people behind your favorite history pages. Super excited for tonight. We have Don from What's the Scuttlebutt Podcast. He runs some great podcast platforms. Also, What's the Scuttlebutt with Jeff Copsetta and Henry Sledge as well. He does living history. He's just another history nerd like all of us too. So we'll get him on here in just a second. Just to remind everybody, this is also a live Q&A, so you are more than welcome to ask questions. On the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, there is a little question mark bubble. I just ask that you submit your questions there, as sometimes they do get lost in the comments. So we'll wait for people to join. Let's see. Oh, let's go ahead and get Don on. He just popped on. Just a second. Hey!
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for having me on.
Huh?
So thanks for having me on.
Oh yeah, well thanks for coming on. So I super appreciate it. So
No worries.
yeah, how's the weather in Florida today?
Hot, 94. First day without rain in a while.
Oh, without rain?
Yeah, it's been raining a lot. It rains every day down here in the summertime. You set your watch by.
Oh, that's not
Yep,
fun.
every day about 5 to 7 o'clock.
5 to oh, well, so awesome. Who's that on your lap?
This is Bailey, the Boston Terrier.
Hi, Bailey. Look at those eyes.
Yeah, she usually sits in here on our podcast, and usually by the end of the episode, she wants in my lap, but she got an early start tonight.
Yeah, she was like, I want on the lap now. So, well, do you want to just get it rolling?
Sure, let's start.
All
I'm
right.
ready when you are.
Yeah, so let's start off with the fun question that starts it all for all of us. How did you get into history?
Oh boy, you can kind of see behind me I have an M1 helmet.
Mm-hmm.
My grandfather served over in European theater. He did grave registration, but he never talked about it, obviously, because of what he's seen.
Yeah.
Like a lot of other people, right after 9/11, Band of Brothers premiered. Spent a lot of time distracting myself watching that. Then when I moved to California to go to school for computers, I had basically Band of Brothers on my computer along with other videos, just watched the hell out of it. And then basically fast forward to when I moved to Florida, for some reason I was on eBay one night, and I don't know why, unprovoked, I bought an M1 helmet.
Mm-hmm.
Price is right, thought it was cool.
Yeah.
Got it in the mail and realized how damn heavy it was.
Mm-hmm.
And thought it was cool, sat at my office, and when people would come to my house, they would pick it up. I'm like, wow, this thing's heavy. I'm like, yeah. And then I realized, oh, wait a minute. Here's people who never previously had an interest in World War II or even the topic, but just them feeling this helmet and how heavy it was, now it just sparked, whether it's a 30-second conversation or a 10-minute conversation. Usually I couldn't imagine wearing this all the time. Yeah. And I realized just having something tangible in their hand, like an M1 helmet, really sparked their interest, whether it's a short period of time or a long period of time. And as I started reading more books and researching World War II myself, I slowly started developing a World War II impression. It's funny, World War II reenacting was something I was always interested in, but there was always a barrier to entry, which is the money. Mm-hmm. And when I lived in Ohio before moving to California, I actually had a friend of mine who did Civil War reenacting and World War II reenacting, but I never got into it. And then basically I got that helmet, and at the time I was really into the Pacific, which I still am. The PTO is more my area of expertise. And so I made the strategic mistake of building my first impression around the United States Marine Corps. And I say the strategic mistake is because at the time, no one was doing Marine Corps events. And so by the time I took a year to build my my Marine Corps impression and started looking for groups to hang out with, couldn't find any. So I actually fell in with the 1st Infantry Division Army impression group. They let me set up my small thing of gear at their living history events, and I kind of learned off of them. And over time, just made the transition and built an Army impression as well. And I tell people I have an unexplainable, unquenchable thirst for all things World War II knowledge. I don't know why, other than, like, when what little bit of free time I have, I spend all my time reading World War II books. I mean, everything over here, it's all World War II stuff.
Yeah.
And so I don't know why. It's just the irony is growing up I had a learning disability. Could not read. Couldn't. I was basically in LD classes for science, not science, reading, and math. Well, it makes sense that I'm in there for science if I can't read, right? Reading and science goes hand in hand. But what I learned is I didn't have an interest in what we were reading. And the weird thing is I tell people I'm like a broken radio. When I'm reading, I can receive the signal. Mm-hmm. But when I'm reading aloud, that signal comes out blotchy and kind of broken down. Mm-hmm. But over years, and especially when I started working in radio in 2012, and then when I started podcasting in 2018, obviously you got to read things out loud, and I got better at doing it. Mm-hmm. But how I got into reading is someone made the mistake of getting me a Barnes & Noble gift card like in 2003. I'm like, what the hell am I going to do? I don't read. I can't read.
Yeah.
And so I was flying back from Long Beach to Ohio when I lived in Long Beach. And I stopped at the bookstore in LAX because I had a layover. And there was a book. I think I have it over here. Yeah. Came across this book on the shelf.
Oh,
this is the Brothers in Arms, Best of Friends, the story of Babe Heffron and Garnier.
Yeah.
As I said, I was a big, huge fan of Band of Brothers. So I'm like, ooh, this is something I have an interest in. And I read this book. This was the first book that I had read outside of school voluntarily. And that's when it sparked me, which we try to teach kids now. You don't like reading, it's because you don't like what you're reading. Here, I found something that I already had pre-knowledge on the subject matter from the Band of Brothers. And I read the book twice, and it was at that point it snapped for me. And I just started buying World War II books and reading them. And I can't explain why I had the desire, but it's the way it is.
Just the way it is. So you started.
Yep, it's the way it is.
So you started reading more World War II books before, after you were doing the living history. You wanted to do that?
Leading into it, obviously, if you're going to do living history versus reenacting, for some in your audience who may be new to the subject matter, what's the difference? The difference is reenacting is playing war where you're physically reenacting, you're redoing battles. Living history is usually at a museum. There's no battle. You bring out your collection, you bring out your gear, you set up a display. It's kind of like Comic-Con without the comic books.
Yeah.
You know, except for the people we're talking about and the people we're impersonating actually existed. That's the big difference. But in order to do, you're not going to go to Comic-Con and set up a booth if you don't know anything about comic books, right?
Yeah.
So you're not going to go to a living history event and set up your gear if A, you have social anxiety and can't talk to people, and B, if you don't know what you're talking about. So it kind of goes hand in hand where you got to pick a subject, and for me it's the Marine Corps and 1st Infantry Division. So yeah, I just kept reading because I had that unquenchable thirst, and I need to at least look like I know what I'm talking about when I'm at these events.
Yeah. So how did, oh shoot, I just lost the question. Sorry. It had to do with living.
How the podcast come to be?
How long have you been doing living history? I don't know if you said that. If you did, I'm sorry.
I would have to go back and look at my Facebook, but I'm going to say about 9 years now. Probably 9 or 10 years.
What is?
Because like I said, it took me a year to build my impression before I did my first, I just now realize this. I had never been to a living history event before I did my first. I never been to one as a guest. I had gone to air shows as a kid, but I had never actually, I just realized this after all these years, I had never attended a living history event until the day I showed up dressed up in my Marine Corps uniform to participate in a living history event.
How does that happen?
That was about 10 years ago. I don't know. Like I said, it took me a year to build my impression, and then I basically went on Facebook, and I found a guy named John Thomas in Tampa. He ran a 1st Infantry Division, and they were putting on an event down in Naples, which was 45 minutes from me. And I reached out to him on the internet. He said, sure, you know, we do Army, but it's a living history event, not a reenactment, so bring what you have, set it up, and talk to people. And it's kind of like anything else. The first time you do something, you just kind of hang around to people who's been doing it a lot, see how they're doing it, figure out how you can take the information you know and relay it to people. And that and the fact that I had worked sales since I was 18. I've sold everything, literally, no hyperbole. I've sold everything from big screen TVs to women's swimwear. And so to have and so basically, going back to our analogy, but instead of instead of Comic-Con, think of like a trade show. You're a plumber. You got to go to a plumbing trade show. Well, you have a booth at a trade show. You're trying to sell your business or your plumbing fixture. Living history is the same thing, but you're trying to sell history to people.
Yeah.
You're trying to get people who, for whatever reason, a lot of times it's a family member who drags the rest of the family out. They're not really there to be there. They're just making somebody in the family happy. So you got to sell them on that history. You got to make them happy that they showed up.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of the salesman in me as well.
Oh, that's that's pretty. I find that so interesting that you didn't do any living history events until your first one that you were actually a part of. That's just
Like I said, 10 years later, and I just now had that epiphany. I had never attended one as a spectator. First one I'd ever been to, with the exception of maybe, there may have been something at a air show that I went to in like elementary school, but I don't actively remember going to anything. To this day, I've never even been to a Renaissance fair. As crazy as that is. So I mean,
there am I.
Yeah, it was my first time even being at a living history event, was being part of one.
Yeah. Oh, that is super awesome. So you collect, you go to these living history events, and you set up your stuff. You dress the part. You dress in your uniform, and you just people come by, and you just talk about. What do you talk about for you?
Well, to keep yourself interested in the hobby and to keep yourself active, I find people's interest will kind of wane over the years and change. Like, so when I started 10 years ago, it was Marine Corps stuff. So I bring out my, my original haversacks, my different canteens. There's the Marine Corps pith helmet that,
Freddie Joe said, yeah.
Yeah. And this is actually this pith helmet is made by the same company who made Holly Liner. It actually has the Holly stamp on the bottom. But to answer your question, it depends. Like, it depends on the living history event, depends on the timeline. But early on, I talked a lot of Marine Corps stuff, and then I developed the 1st Infantry impression. So then I would go to certain events, talk about 1st Infantry. So now, it keeps me a little interested. I'm not giving the same sales pitch. You do want to have a sales pitch because, once again, you're talking to people, you're regurgitating the same information, and so you don't want to stand there and stumble. You want to give that sales pitch, and so it is kind of a sales pitch. You want to relay that information quickly and informatively so they can get the information. And then over the years, I built a 82nd Airborne impression. So then that gave me something new to learn about, something more exciting. And now I have 2 field telephones. I can talk about the EE8 field telephones. I found 2 on eBay. I reconditioned them. And that's what's really fun. Having young kids who've never seen, maybe, possibly they've been to their grandma's and seen like an old phone on, now when I say old, I'm talking like 1999 phones,
Exactly.
But they may see a push-button phone from Radio Shack in their grandma's bedroom, but when you pull out an EE8 telephone and you're doing the winding and you have someone down on the other end of the camp who's just as involved as you are, you have those kids wind that up, and all of a sudden there's somebody on the other end. And it's usually fun. You have them order a pizza, do something, but to them it's mind-blowing. This is like ancient artifact, this 80-year-old telephone. They're used to, iPhones and Android phones, so stuff like that gets them super interactive. And so I, talk things like that. One of the weird things that we've talked about on the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast is most living historians have something that bites them. Don't know what it is. For me, it's M1 helmets. So I got 3 of them up there.
Yeah.
The Airborne helmet is a D-bail rigger helmet. It's front seam. The one in the middle is that's a fixed bail, D-bail. The one in the middle is a fixed bail flat front seam that the Marine Corps used. I have another one over there. I got my pith helmet. I have my civilian helmet. And then the other thing is canteens. I got like 6 or 7 different model canteens just because canteens are rudimentary, but they're a staple of life. You can't survive the field without a canteen. And you would think it'd just be, here's a canteen, it works, keep to make them. No, they tried many different canteens. They had the black porcelain canteens. They had different seams. Well, we found out if you do a horizontal seam, if you fell on it, it would split the water leak out. So let's do a vertical seam on the sides. And so there's different caps. You'd see the exact same canteen, but different cap. You're like, is that because of manufacturer, different specs? And so just weird little things like M1 helmets or different style canteens is my thing. Like with Jeff, you've had on the podcast, he's really into, the 8th Air Force. And so that's kind of something else, we all kind of do just to keep things lively and interested. Everybody has that one little thing that they're into. And so when you're at an event and someone says, hey, can you tell me about, what was this telephone? Oh, the EE8 phones? Well, I don't know too much about it, but Jeremy Petrola from Georgia, he's down there. He has an entire layout of the communications. Send them down there. Or, oh, you want to know about typewriters and field desk, you need to go see Paul over here. And so everybody has their own little niche, so that when people are going from tent to tent or display to display, they're not hearing the same exact thing from 30 different people.
Yeah, that have a genre of a collection. So with your M1 helmets in your canteen are like the thing that you have, just like I told you about the USS Indianapolis when I was on your guys' podcast. Do you have an event that you just have a weird obsession with that you know a lot about or anything, or just you always just come back to it?
I don't have a particular event. I do have a bucket list, which is Connie, the D-Day reenactment up in Ohio, which ironically I spent 15 years of my life in Ohio, but as I said, I got involved in reenacting in Florida, so I'd never been to Connie when I lived in Ohio. That's on my bucket list. But as far as like reoccurring events that we go to, my favorite one, the most enjoyable, especially for a content creator, someone who's done radio, someone who does podcasts, someone who's done some background acting or some improv, is we have an event down here. It's not completely historically accurate. It's more of a fundraiser for the Florida Train Museum, and it's called the Von Passenger Express. And what's so different about this particular event is it takes place at a train museum, as the name implies. But the train actually has 8 miles of track. And so what we do, think of like a murder mystery dinner train ride, but without the murder and the dinner. People pay, they buy tickets, they come down to the museum. By the time that it opens to the public, all the Allies are gone. So when you pull in, there's a German checkpoint, there's giant German flags, you got Weimar Republic guys walking around, you got guys in SS uniforms walking around. You come to get on the train, they're asking for your papers, they give you, you know, fake little passports with the eagle and the swastika on it, and they put them on the train. And the difference is, versus a normal living history event, this gives you the ability to improv, to act, if you will. Because now you got to stay in character, because now you're in 1943 France, whatever the timeline happens to be. Interestingly enough, how do you do that during the pandemic? How do you put a bunch of people on a train with masks and be historically accurate? Well, aforementioned Paul was put to that task. And he said, easy. This is a hospital tuberculosis train.
Oh.
So that explains why everybody has masks on. And all the World War II reenactors, we basically covered our mask up with bandanas or whatever you had worn in 1943 to give the appearance. So that way, because the museum raises so much money during this one event, we did not want to cancel it for the pandemic. And so we just changed it up. Now you're on a tuberculosis train, so we all wear masks. But anyhow, back to the point. The train goes down. It stops 4 miles down. The Germans take off a pilot they captured to go out and execute him. The airborne comes out of the woods. There's a skirmish. Sadly, airborne loses. Germans get back on the train with another prisoner or two, sometimes on the prisoner, which is fun because then they push me through the train and I'm all handcuffed and there's interaction and this and that. Train goes down in the track. They take me out or whoever the prisoners are, along with some of the people on the train because they're going to execute them. Allies come. There's another skirmish. This time the Allies take over the train. So on the 5 mile train ride back, Art and some of the organizers, people who can act, stay in character and improv, they literally have scripts that they act out in each train to give the audience a show. And like I said, it's not, you know, when it comes to living history, it's not historically accurate per se, but it's fun for the audience and it's fun for the reenactors who, you know, it gives us a chance to do our hobby, but have a little fun with it too, opposed to just your normal, you know, here's this event, here's exactly what happened. And so that's a fun event. And the other fun event that I go to every February is up in Lakeland, Georgia. It's at a Boy Scout camp, interestingly enough, called Camp Patton. And it's a tactical / public reenactment. Now, terminology again, for those who don't know, a tactical event is basically for us. That's when you go out in the woods, there's no public around. It's the one time you actually don't see cars in the background. You don't smell an elephant ear booth over at the fair. It's you in your uniforms versus whoever. And you, for example, the Georgia event, it's a 4-hour tactical. We walk 8 miles. And we have a mission objective to take. It's a battle reenactment just for us. And then by the time we get up to that 4 miles, the public is there. and then we put on a 45-minute public battle, and then we have our displays, and then we do the history as well. So it's kind of all-encompassing. If you like tactical events, you get that out of the way. If you like living history, you get that out of your way. And it's fun to, sleep in a tent in Georgia and wake up and it's 28 degrees and there's ice in your car. So you get that too. You get to enjoy it's the closest you'll get to the walk a mile in a man's shoes. That used to be a thing. You want to know how somebody felt? Walk a mile. Well, we're literally walking a mile in their shoes. So it's a fun way of doing it.
Oh, that's awesome. Let's switch gears a little bit and let's start talking about
Sure.
podcasts. So you worked in radio,
yep.
Correct? How long did you work in radio?
It's a little tricky to manage because I did work for the radio show remotely. I got started with them because when I moved down here, I started an IT firm in 2004, and I had a fleet van, just AM, FM radio. It was just your rudimentary basic fleet van. So I would drive around all day listening to radio shows. And I'd hear the radio host complain that their computers weren't working. Now, if you're a public figure, even if you're just a local celebrity, quote unquote, you do have fans who are a little nutty. And so after you've been doing it a while, like these guys, they have been on the same radio station since 1996 when I was in high school. You have to be kind of protective, especially you don't want people to know where you live because they may be nutballs. Yeah. And so when they're complaining that their computers are broke, I emailed them, which I had emailed them different things in the past. And I said, hey, not only can I fix your computer, I can do it remotely, and you can watch me do it. So here you have two people who are local celebrities. They don't know me from Adam. I can fix their computer. I don't need to know where they live.
Yeah.
I don't have to come to their house, and they can watch to make sure I'm not spying on all the crap.
Yeah.
So long story short, fixed their computers. They reached out to me. Hey, do you know anything about building websites? As a matter of fact, I do. So I took over their website. Do you know anything about managing Facebook pages? I currently manage 5, so I started managing their Facebook page. And as they're doing shows, I would be out driving around town, and they'd talk about a landmark. If I was nearby, I'd take a picture and post their Facebook page or whatever. And long story short, their producer quit, and they reached out to me. They said, hey, we need a producer. We can't think of anybody who knows the show as well as you do. And by the way, you already manage our Facebook and our website. So long story short, I basically adjusted my schedule. I started working 5 in the morning, doing computers until 1, go and do radio from 2 to 6, and then sometimes go back and do computer work until 11 o'clock at night.
Oh, wow.
I did that for about 6 years paid, actively on-air personality, and then, as we all know, streaming. Spotify, YouTube, Pandora, radio, terrestrial. Stream their stuff in their cars, less revenue from commercials. And so the entire industry just changed. The job I was working paid $40,000 in 2004. When I was doing it, it was paying me $9 an hour. And so when the bands and the concerts dried up and all the other stuff, and I turned 40, I said, this is great, but yeah, I don't want to be 40 working a $9 an hour job, even though I had a business. I need to focus on my business. And so I left radio, and my goal was to focus on the business so that my dad and my stepmother could retire, and I could take the business over. And it's one of those weird things like where the universe said, hey, this is going to happen or it's not, because 3 weeks to the day that I left, my stepmother had an accident and passed away.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And so it would have been, even if I wouldn't have left radio and trained somebody for 2 months, I would have left radio 2 months later in a lot more difficult position. But yeah, so I working in radio is how I got into doing podcasts.
Into podcasts. So let's talk about what's the Scuttlebutt. So
sure.
How was it birthed? How did it come about?
It kind of had to do something with radio. Once again, radio was trying to figure out how to survive in modern days. And radio is not big on transition changing. They're a breed of, this is the way we've done it, this is the way we're going to do it. And so it's funny now when you watch NBC, you watch TV or radio, you hear them promoting all their podcasts. But to be honest, they were about 8 years too late. They got into the podcast game 8 years after everybody else was doing it, because that's radio. And so they're trying to figure out, how can we get and radio synonymously cheap. So the question was, how can we get content on our websites for basically free?
Mm-hmm.
I know. We already hire on-air personalities. Now, I was an hourly employee part-time because I only worked 4 hours a day, whereas most of them are salary employees. I know, let's get our on-air personalities we're already paying and have them do podcasts. So they approached me and said, hey, you annoy the hell out of everybody with your Facebook post with all this World War II crap. You're constantly bringing this World War II crap up online. Do you think you can do a half-hour show once a week? Sure. Now, this was right after Thanksgiving.
Mm-hmm.
They said, can you start doing a half-hour, just one episode a week? I said, sure. Give me till January. Because I already had plans and ideas, and because I knew from, I'm trying to be vague about this just so I don't get my foot in my mouth, but I knew from sitting in certain things in radio. Perfect example. When you call on a radio station, you want to be on a radio show because they're giving away a prize. As soon as you call that radio station and you're on their phone and you're on the air, they're recording you. Because you called in that radio station and you're on their phone, on their equipment, they can do whatever they want with that recording. That recording of your voice becomes their property. And so I kind of knew this, and I wasn't sure how long my life in radio would be. So I thought to myself, hey, self, instead of recording your podcast at the radio station on their equipment so they own it, build your own studio in your own house. And so that's what I did. So I built a studio in my own house, and I started doing 1 hour to 2 hour long episodes. That lasted for about 8 to 10 episodes, and then I left the company. But since I recorded them on my own equipment, on my own time, on my own house, one, I wasn't on the clock when I was doing it, so they weren't paying me to do it. They never gave me any additional money for doing it, so I did it for free, recorded it in my own house, on my own equipment, with my own software. Only thing they did was put it on their website. So technically they own those few episodes because they're hosting it. And so I intentionally didn't put those episodes up on mine. And so when I left, I continued doing it. The website was registered to me. The website's hosted, WTSP was hosted on my servers. Not only that, but when I uploaded to theirs, I uploaded to mine too. So like the early episodes are still on their website buried somewhere. But once again, they never paid me, did it at home. So there was no real way to claim any ownership to it. And at the time, I was doing 2 other podcasts as well. And so when you look at the What's the Scuttlebutt stencil logo, you'll see it says like WTSP. I'm looking up, and it'll say US 070820, 18. And when I was coming up with the logo, because I designed my own logos, I wanted something to look like a serial number, a service number, but I wanted it to have meaning. And so when you look at that stencil, that number is actually the date my very first episode aired. So January 8th, 2018. And so whenever I look at the logo, so when's your first episode? I'm like, oh, let me go. Oh, yeah, it's January 8th, 2018. And so when I first started doing it, it was just me. And there's nothing harder. Even though I worked in radio, I wasn't trained in radio. I was an IT guy. So I didn't have the formal training of sitting in a studio, talking to the audience, sounding like you were having a conversation with the world. I came in as having a conversation with 2 guys in real time. And even that took me 3 years to get prolific. And so to do a podcast by myself, having a learning disability, trying to read aloud, it was very stilted. And so if you go back and listen to those first few episodes, you'll hear little promos I do by myself, and they're very stilted and it's very amateurish. But what I did intentionally was I found guests to come on, someone to talk to, because I had that experience in radio talking to people in real time. And so by having guests on, it made it easier for me to put out more interesting shows. And luckily at that time, I was lucky enough and privileged enough to have interviewed 6 or 7 World War II vets and or people who were alive at the time. My biggest regret is I didn't start the podcast earlier, not to get ahead of the curve or not to do it first, just to have access to people. One of the things we talk about on What's the Scuttlebutt now, the complete version, because now it's me, Jeff Kopp, Seta, and Henry Sledge. So we have 3 people providing 3 content, and the show's completely different than what it was in its infancy, because it was an infant project. It was me trying to figure out ways. But one of my biggest wishes is I wish I had done this podcast 7 years ago. One time I was on a computer job, Fort Myers Beach, and I was walking out of an ice cream parlor, and there was a car parked out in front.
Mm-hmm.
The daughter was inside and in the passenger seat, window down, enjoying the cool air. It was an older gentleman. He had a first Division Marine Corps hat on.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked him, I said, what years did you serve? And he's like, 42 to 44. I was like, oh, wow, you were there in the beginning. Now, at this time, the war was, 72 years ago. I'm sure in the last 72 years, this guy's been asked every question from how many Japs have he killed to the most grotesque stuff in the world. Yeah. I didn't approach it from that. Mm-hmm. I had read, aforementioned my co-host Henry Sledge, I've read his father's book, With the Old Breed, many times. I read his best friend Sid Phillips' book, You'll Be Sorry. I had read A Helmet for My Pillow by Robert Leckie, cover to cover like 6 or 7 times. And so I knew about, and what I brought up to him, and it sparked this thing in his eye. And we had a conversation for 45 minutes in the parking lot. Didn't bring up killing, shooting, combat at all. We talked about when we sent the Marines down towards the Pacific, they first stopped in New Zealand and Australia. Mm-hmm. And the New Zealand dock workers decided that they weren't getting paid enough and they were going to go on union strike. Uh-huh. Because we were in such a hurry that we didn't battle load our ships. All the guns were on one ship, all the ammo was on one ship, all the jeeps were on one ship, all the K rations were on one ship. Usually you battle load, you consolidate, and every ship basically has a little bit of everything. In case one gets sunk, you didn't lose all the canteens or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so what they had to do is they had to offload all the ships, consolidate everything, battle load them, and reload them. Well, there was a huge, horrible rainstorm, like typhoon, and the dock workers like, hey, we're not getting paid enough for this, we're out. They bounced. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Marine Corps Navy said, no worries. We got plenty of guys used to running some equipment back in the United States. Mm-hmm. And so there's a great in-depth story in Sid Phillips' book and Robert Leckie's book about the dock workers union strike and how they had to work 24-hour shifts 8-hour shifts rotating for 24 hours a day for like 2 weeks on end to battle load these ships, and how it was raining and all the boxes of cornflakes fell apart and there's just mounds of soggy cornflakes in the docks, and all the can labels fell off the can, so you didn't know if you had peaches, pineapples, baked beans, or what. But it was, mm-hmm. And so we talked about that stuff. We talked about Melbourne. We actually talked about all the stuff they did that wasn't in combat. And I was probably the first time in this guy's post-war existence, prior to, with the exception, probably talking to other guys who were there, that came up and talked to him about his war experience without bringing up combat or war. And it just lit up his eyes, because I was reminding him of the quote-unquote good times. Even though it sucked being in that cold-ass rain, doing that horrible job, it beats the hell out of living in a foxhole, having Japanese trying to bonsai charge you in the middle of the night.
Exactly.
And I really wish I had my podcast or just rudimentary recording equipment that day, because that would have been a fantastic interview.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of us regret, because a lot of the World War II veterans, they're in their late 90s, they're 98, 99, and they're passing away. My Opa is a World War II vet. He passed away, I think, 11 years ago, I think it is. No, that's wrong. I just posted about it. I'm totally blanking, but when they lived in Michigan, and when I would go to Michigan all the time, I was a kid. I didn't ask many of those questions. I didn't talk about the war with them. I wanted to go swimming in their pool. I wanted to do stuff like that. And then now, people now there's very few veterans left, and it just sucks that we couldn't ask, those vets sooner than now. But so let's go.
That's the other. Not to interrupt real quick, but just because we're on the point, that's the other strategic thing I made. If you look at my logo, it says your favorite World War II based podcast, because that gives me the opening to talk to a Korean War vet. I've decided early on that if someone comes to me and says, hey, I got somebody who served in Desert Storm, I got somebody who served in Gulf War, I got somebody who served in Korean War who has a good story to tell, I don't want to say, hey, your war wasn't important enough, we only do World War II. So by putting World War II based, that gives me and the audience to know, hey, every once in a while we might drift away from the subject and talk about something completely different, because I feel no one's war was any more or less important than anyone else's war, regardless of when they served. Mm-hmm. And with time being time, pretty soon, if we're going to do interviews of vets, they're going to be Korean War, Vietnam War,
yeah.
Gulf War, etc.
Yeah, and
So
even so, the Korean war vets are getting up there because a lot of men who served in World War II actually served in Korea too. If they still stayed in, and Korea is one of the forgotten wars.
yeah,
It's not really spoken about, and so I've spoken to a few other history people on here, and they're starting to get into interviewing those Korean War vets and getting their stories out because we don't have a lot of books on them. We don't have a lot of movies on. Chosen, I think, is the only movie that comes to the top of my head about the Korean War that I can even think of, and so it's
and I think the other part of that for the vets comes with time.
Yeah.
Obviously, World War II, everybody was there. Why talk about it? Now you're bragging.
Exactly.
Korean War, it was horrible. Why talk about it? Now you're bragging. Mm-hmm. But as these guys and girls get older, they start to realize, hey, we're not a whole hell of a lot of us left. Mm-hmm. There's interest in this story, so why not get it out there so that our memories aren't lost and faded? And so it's almost twofold. You got to interview them before they're gone, but you also got to wait till they get to the age where they can justify talking about it without feeling like a braggart.
Yeah, exactly. I completely agree with you on that. So let's go a little bit to let's fast forward a little bit with What's the Scuttlebutt and go to how did you, Jeff, and Henry connect? How did it become how it is now? How it is today with all of you guys?
Doing what you're doing.
Doing
exactly what you're doing. Finding finding a story, a photo, something that sparks your interest on Instagram and reaching out to people.
Yeah.
One of the other things I did early on, and the reason I host 3 podcasts. I have the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast, the What's in Your Head podcast that was formerly the Waterman and D-Train show. D-Train was my on-air name, and Waterman was another guy I worked with in radio. He's gone. We transitioned. Mm-hmm. What's the Scuttlebutt podcast is on episode 121. What's in Your Head podcast is on season 4, episode 21. I think I've done like 300 episodes of that. Mm-hmm. And the Failed podcast is a limited series motivational podcast that I just find people who basically found success in their own way and or found success in things that have a high turnover rate. But the reason there's such a discrepancy in the episodes for What's the Scuttlebutt versus What's in Your Head is I decided early on the subject matter was too important to push one out for the sake of getting one out.
Yeah.
I didn't want to just rush out an episode of the What's the Scuttlebutt because I need to have numbers. What's in Your Head is just that. We can sit down and talk about whatever the hell's going on in the media, in our life, or whatever. So the subject matter is not that important. It's just a general entertainment podcast. We literally, yet the other night we talked about a TikTok that I had done. Prior to the show, had 5,000 views. When I got off the show, it had 30,000 views, and as of right now, before I came on this show, has 887,000 views. I might hit 1 million by tomorrow morning. And all that was, long story short, I was at my UPS store. UPS man was pissed off at somebody who left the dog in their car that I didn't know about. I literally walked out of the UPS store. He said, "Hey, I'm pissed off this guy. Can you come document this?" Mm-hmm. I'm like, "What?" I thought maybe someone hit his UPS truck. I thought maybe he backed into somebody and didn't have his phone. He wanted me to document an accident for insurance. And they said, this guy left his blank dog in the car. And I'm like, huh? And I look and I see his dog in the car. I was like, well, is the window open? Is the door open? He's like, I don't know. As soon as I went to grab the door, the owner comes out and starts screaming. I literally recorded 1.5 minutes of this conversation between the dog owner who left his dog in a hot car and a UPS driver who's screaming at him, which, by the way, the UPS driver asked me to document it. He didn't tell me what to do with it once I did, but anyhow. So because of that interaction, this stupid video has gotten close to 1 million views in the last 3 days. So I'm watching this thing blow up and watching my TikTok account blow up. But I forget your original question. We were talking about the podcast. Oh, how me and Jeff. Anyhow, doing what you're doing. I would go to Instagram, I'd go to Facebook, Twitter, and find someone posting about World War II who had a lot of knowledge. I'd say, hey, I host a World War II podcast. I have some knowledge, but you have knowledge on this particular topic, as you do. And would you come on my show? And that's how I'd get guests, and people would put me up their grandfathers or whatever. I was on Instagram one day, and I saw this cool little photo from this little company called Black 17 Productions. They were shooting a movie out on the what I call the sound stage, but they called it their battlefield out at the National Museum of Pacific War. It was a short little film on Marine Corps war dogs. Sent them an email. Hey, well, first I sent a comment. Hey, can you like me so we can have a conversation? Otherwise, my message is going to go in your inbox and you'll never find it. I'm sure you're familiar with that process.
Go to the other box. Yeah.
Yeah. So they followed me. I said, hey, my name's Don Abernathy. I host a World War II based podcast. I saw these pictures. I would love to interview somebody with your production company about your project. They replied back, can we get some information? So I sent them a link, sent them information about me, and they came back, and this is R.J. Nevins and his wife Chelsea, didn't know them at the time. They said, hey, we see you're in Florida. We're actually going to be in Florida shooting the last scene of our movie in a month. Do we need to come to your studio, or can you come out to the house where we're staying to do the interview? No, by the way, it's in this little place called Matlacha in Pine Island. Do you know where it's at? I replied back, yes, Matlacha in Pine Island is 15 minutes behind my dad's house. It's in my town. So, and absolutely, I can come out to your casting house to interview all your actors. And so one thing led to another. They actually invited me out to the pre-shoot dinner, so I went out there the day before. Jeff Copsoda was their historical advisor, and at the time, the living history director for the National Museum of Pacific War. And so his job was, obviously, to provide the set in Texas, plus they brought him out to Florida to make sure the uniforms were right and all the historical accuracy. And so they introduced me to Jeff. And then the next day, they invited me out to the film shoot. So if you go on, and by the way, Walking Point is available on YouTube right now. And the last half of it, where they're in the jungle, was shot on in an old defunct palm tree plantation out here on Matlacha and Pine Island. And I was there that day. I was helping Jeff get the actors with their leggings on and all that stuff. And anyhow, spent the day with them shooting out in the hot heat. And at the end of the day, I took my podcast studio in a box and went to the house at the Airbnb. Interviewed RJ, who's the director and the writer, producer. Interviewed all four main actors in it. Basically interviewed everybody. Turned into 3 different episodes. Bailey in the category and edit. I apologize for that. Bailey, come on. And long story short, we had such a great time on that interview. I had one of the actors email me, said, I've listened to that episode 20 times because I got to relive. If you don't know, whenever you've done filming a film project, they have a wrap party.
Yeah.
Like whenever you're doing a movie or a TV show, when your part as an actor is done, whether it's on episode 4 or halfway through the movie, okay, Don come out and shot his scene. That's a wrap for Don. Everybody say bye to Don. Well, so each actor who's role in that TV show or movie ends, that's a wrap for Steve. Yeah. Well, at the end of the project, they have a wrap party where everybody gets together and they celebrate and all that. And so we had such a good time at the wrap party that I basically reached out and did follow-up interviews with RJ again and then Jeff. And long story short, I interviewed Jeff 3 times. Bailey, would you leave the cat alone? Hey, psst. And long story short, I got invited out to Texas to do an episode of the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast from the National Museum of Pacific War. And that went so well that Jeff came on more and more, and we just had such a good time that we decided, hey, you should be the co-host. So now I have someone to talk to all the time. I can get more episodes out because I'm not stuck. You know, if I couldn't find a guest, I wouldn't do a show. Because once again, me doing an episode by myself, it sounded stilted and amateurish. Whereas when I'm talking to somebody like you and I are doing right now, it's semi-interesting and, you know, people would listen. And so Jeff was on, and we started putting out episodes every week and start getting listeners and topics. Jeff, once again, I do Marine Corps stuff, but so does Jeff. But Jeff knows a lot about airplanes that I don't know about. He knows a lot about the 8th. And so we're able to expand the content of the show, plus bring on guests. And so now some episodes we had 3 people instead of 2. And so that went for probably, I'd say up close to episode 100. I think it was me and Jeff up till maybe episode 80, 90. And backtracked a little bit. There's an event in Fort Morgan, Alabama. We did the 75th anniversary of Tarawa and the 75th anniversary of Peleliu. And the Peleliu event was fantastic because we had landing crafts. As a reenactor, if you could ride a landing craft, that's bucket list, especially a landing craft in real water. And the guy who organized that event, great guy, I had him on the show. His name's Galen Wagner. Galen had been on my show to promote, and that's one of the other things that what Scuttlebutt did in the early days is we would use it as a promotional vehicle for living history events. Hey, you're in Pennsylvania. You want to get people to show up? Come on the show. We'll talk, tell people when it is, what it is. Mm-hmm. And so we had Galen on to promote these different events up in Alabama. Now, I don't want to go full fanboy here, but if you are a PTO living historian, you're going to like The Pacific, the HBO miniseries The Pacific. It's all about Eugene Sledge, John Basilone, Robert Leckie, Sid Phillips. I have, interestingly enough, I was walking through Barnes & Noble one day, and PBS put out a documentary called The War. Uh-huh. And there's a book of it, and this is before The Pacific was ever made. It hadn't even been announced yet. Mm-hmm. I was walking through Barnes & Noble, and I found a hardbook copy of The War, and I bought it and I read it. And in that hardbook copy, there is a chapter written by Sid Phillips. And mm-hmm. Sid Phillips was best friends with Eugene Sledge. Mm-hmm. And in his chapter, he included a paragraph from the book with the old breed. Mm-hmm. And so I read that and quickly went on eBay. Mm-hmm. And I bought this guy for $13.
Oh yeah.
This came out. This is like the first.
Like the original, like the original art cover. Yeah.
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 Bought this thing for $13 off eBay. Mm-hmm. Read it twice. Was so excited. I went to Carrie. I said, "Hey, if Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg does another miniseries, it needs to be about this cat. This is a fantastic book."
Yeah.
About 6 months later, they announced the production of HBO The Pacific. Now, here's a book I read twice through. Mm-hmm. Miniseries is coming out. A huge fan of Band of Brothers. Mm-hmm. Watched The Pacific. When I worked in radio, the host of my show got me the box set for my birthday. I got Marine Corps impressions. Mm-hmm. Through and through. Did a Tarawa, Peleliu reenactment. And so one morning out of nowhere, I get a text message from Galen Wagner on my phone. Eugene Sledge, his son, is interested in getting in podcasts. Would you be interested in having him on your show?
Yeah.
I'd be like, if you're a baseball fan, saying, hey, the great-grandson of Babe Ruth is wanting to get in a podcast. You want to have him on your show? So it was like, sure.
Yes.
And so the original idea, and I called up Jeff, said, you won't believe this. Jeff's like, what? I was like, Galen Wagner just called me, said that that Eugene, it's so funny, I talk to Henry so much now that I call his dad by his name. I said, Eugene Sledge's son is coming on our show. Jeff's like, what the? Because Jeff worked at the National Museum of Pacific War. Outside of his office, someone had bought some of the artifacts from the HBO miniseries Pacific. And so outside of Jeff's office, he had this plastic box with these artifacts with the picture from the HBO. So he had, and at the museum, they had Eugene Sledge's stuff. Mm-hmm. And so, long story short, we put the fanboy stuff, we conducted ourselves professionally. Yeah, it's just another dude. And so we had Henry on, and we had him on, and the whole idea was we'll have him on for 3 episodes so he can get a feel of what he felt about podcasting before he went and invested the money and invested the energy in launching a podcast from the ground up. Mm-hmm. And Henry came on. Now, I spent some time in Long Beach, California. Jeff's done some TV work. I've done some background work in TV series, and being in LA, I've been around famous people. And so by the time I was 20, I realized that famous people were normal people with cool jobs. Yeah. That's it. Some of them are, and I worked in radio, so I met all kinds of celebrities. I got pictures of everybody, and I realized, famous people are normal people with just better jobs than what we have. And so after, Henry came on the show, just a normal dude. Just so happens to be his dad's this guy, but when he's on the show, when he came on the first 2 times, it was a lot talking about his dad, but Henry came to us and said, hey, well, actually, let me rewind a little bit. So we had him on for 3 episodes. Mm-hmm. And Jeff and I are like, let's take our shot, right?
Yeah.
So I texted Henry and said, hey, just throwing this out there. If you're interested, instead of launching your own podcast from the ground up, we would love to have you join our established podcast. And Henry was like, sure. And Henry said, but, the only caveat is I want to sail on my own boat. I don't want people to think that I'm just living off my dad's shadow.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, because you've been on the show, you listen to the show.
Yeah.
Henry's like, I know about World War II. Yes, I know about the Pacific and what my dad did, but he too, just like Jeff, he loves the Army Air Corps. He knows his uncle served, in Europe, was a tank commander, won multiple awards. And so Henry wanted to come on with the understanding that, yes, we'll talk about my dad when it comes up naturally, but, I would prefer not to spend every episode talking about my dad. And Jeff and I are like, well, sure, we don't want to talk every episode about your dad, much as we love him, but the content will get stale after a while. If ever, this isn't the, the Pacific podcast. Mm-hmm. And so we were all happy with that arrangement, which is why, I think maybe sometimes a new listener might be surprised they tune in and not hear us talk about Eugene Sledge at all. But when it does come up in a natural progression, we'll talk about it for a couple minutes and we'll move on to other things. And so me, Henry, and Jeff have such a good relationship. And it's so funny because it reminds me of working in radio. When you're a fan of a radio show, you just assume the hosts are best friends. They're talking all the time. It's 24 hours. Me, Henry, and Jeff, we'll do an episode. We'll send some ideas back and forth after the show, or, the morning of the show, we'll hear some ideas. And then we'll go 5-6 days without even talking to each other. Maybe occasional text. We have a group text. We'll throw some, but it's not like we're, young kids just talking and chatting. It's just, we have such a good relationship that when we want to chat, we do. Mm-hmm. But more often than not, we may talk to each other once or twice a week, not counting Mondays when we do our show. And we're all fathers. We all have lives and all that. Yeah. And so it works out quite well. And the other good thing about it too is it prevents me from going back to where I was, as in, when it was me and Jeff, sometimes Jeff has 3 kids. Jeff has multiple jobs. Sometimes Jeff isn't available. And so prior to Henry coming on, Jeff wasn't available. Well, I'll put up a best of that week. Because I have no life. I'm always available because I'm either fishing or I'm home. So I don't have grand adventures I'm going on. But by having Henry, when Henry's not available, it's just me and Jeff. Yeah. When Henry's available and Jeff's available, it's the 3 of us. When Jeff has things to do. And it takes pressure off of everybody. Mm-hmm. One day our goal is to get it where they can do a show if I'm not available. Yeah. Right now it's a little hard to do because I do all the recording. I have all the passwords. I do all the website stuff. They don't know all that stuff right now. Mm-hmm. But it takes the pressure off everybody because now Jeff's not, oh, man, I got to do a show tonight, but I really got to go here. But, if I don't show up, so it takes the pressure off. And so sometimes it's me and Jeff. Sometimes it's me and Henry. Sometimes it's the 3 of us. Sometimes it's 5 of us. Sometimes we'll have 2 guests on. And it just works out really well. And so the long answer to your question is, how did we all meet? Opportunity. Mm-hmm. And kind of dumb luck, really. Yeah. But I don't want to say dumb luck to the fact, but long story short, it was the podcast because I met Jeff through interviewing somebody else who's making a movie. Mm-hmm. I met Henry through someone who's had on my show. Yeah. Who met Henry. Mm-hmm. And the way Galen came into this is a little interesting, and Henry's talking about it on our show, so I'm not talking out of school here. Henry was really into the World War II stuff. Mm-hmm. And then when they started pre-production on the Pacific, it was a lot of talking, sending stuff to them. Tom Hanks, Steven Spielberg came to his house, saw his dad's stuff. And so he was basically living and breathing and dying his dad, World War II, for the entire production. They'd call and ask him questions. They'd be shooting from, hey, we want to do this on this scene. And he'd be like, no, that's not the way it happened. We want to stay true to my dad's, livelihood. And then and I can only imagine how hard it would be to have something as big as the Pacific come out about your father. Yeah. And see some of the historical inaccuracies or see the artistic licensing that always gets taken. Because after all, you have to make the show interesting for the casual viewer or it doesn't turn into the phenomenon that it is. Mm-hmm. And so Henry was a little burnout and a little disenfranchised. Mm-hmm. And it took him from the time the Pacific came out to about 2 years ago. He rewatched it. He had a whole new outlook on it. He had some age into him and life experience. And his interest in World War II sparked. Mm-hmm. And so he started searching Facebook for World War II groups. And so he joined the PTO historical group. I forget the actual name. And so he basically started feeling around a post, and then he threw up on there, hey, I have, people tell me I maybe should look in this podcasting thing. anybody have any ideas? And Galen reached out and said, matter of fact, I know a guy who has a World War II based podcast. I'll see if he's blah, blah, blah. So it was basically through a series of people I have interviewed and relationships that I had created through those interviews that led me to Jeff and led me to Henry.
It's funny how that whole circle thing goes around. So let's talk a little bit more about your guys' podcast recently and guests. You guys have had a lot of amazing guests on. How do you decide who you want to ask? How do you decide like what's interesting to you, or you know, who you want on the show? Because I'm sure you probably do the same thing I do. I just blindly message people and be like, "Hi, I run this little Instagram series. Do you want to be on the show?" So how do you
Absolutely.
How do you choose your guests, and how do you, like, you know?
It'd be like you times 3. You have 3 different guys now. The 3 of us have different interests. You know, when I did the podcast by myself, I did a 120-minute episode with Jay Murray. What does he do? He restores M1 helmets for a living.
Yeah.
One of the things I did is I like to try to find information that's not, and Jeff is the same way. We try to find and talk about stuff that you don't see on the Discovery Channel, on the History Channel, the stuff that's been ran into the ground.
Yeah. I
did an interview with the architect, the historian for the Goodyear Company. Came on, Goodyear Tire, talked about the stuff they did. I would think about things that interest me. Springfield Armory, Springfield Rifles.
Yeah.
Reached out to Springfield Armory. Hey, I have a little World War II podcast. Do you have anybody over there? One of my favorite episodes had 2 guys who works at the Springfield Army Historical Site, which, by the way, I never knew this. George Washington himself chose that site. He created Springfield Army. We got to talk about when John Guerin was there creating M1 rifle and all that stuff. But to answer your question, Henry and Jeff I read, but they read. They'll start saying authors' names as if it's just household names, and I'm like, yeah, I know who you're talking about. And they'll start, they'll start saying names. But anyhow, you got 3 different people, 3 different interests who all host a show. And at first it was Henry, hey, do you mind if I ask? I said, don't ask me. The blanket rule is whoever you guys have an interest in, book them. We have a Google Calendar shared between the 3 of us.
Yeah.
Put it on the calendar so we don't double book. And how we kind of handle it, obviously I started the podcast. I have radio experience and I have more history with doing long-form interviews. Doing long-form interviews is a lot different than doing short-form interview. And one of the crazy things is when you deal with an author, someone who's done a media tour, and you'll probably run into this, hey, I have a little Instagram streaming series, would you be interested to come on? If they have representation, I'm like, sure, can you send us examples of your questions? No, I can't.
No.
Why not? Because I don't have any.
Yeah.
I interview people that nobody knows. With the exception of authors and the occasional actors, at least when I started this podcast, I interviewed veterans. I interviewed World War II historians. My guests don't have IMDb pages. All I know is about, here's my grandfather, he's 94, he was in the 8th Air Force, he served in Europe. That's all I have. So early on, I learned my interview style had to be 2 people sitting at a bar getting to know each other.
Yeah.
So with my veterans, for example, first question, where were you on Pearl Harbor? I would actually listen to their answers and form my next question based off their answer. Living World War II historian, living historians, no one knows you. You work at a mechanic shop at night and you dress up in funny uniforms on the weekend. First question then, what got you in World War II? That forced me to listen. And what I had found was, and you'll see this when you read newspapers, read magazine articles, or internet stuff, if you pay attention to the actual interview, you can determine the true journalist, based on their questions, because they ask a question, they listen to the answer, and they'll do a follow-up question. And then you have the amateurs and the new forms who go into this interview with 20 questions pre-written. While the person's answering the question, they're just waiting for them to shut up. They're not waiting. They're not listening to the answer. They're just literally waiting for them to stop talking so they can ask the next predefined question that was cleared by their person. And it makes for a very boring, very stale interview.
Yeah.
And so it kind of forces you. And so what we do with that, and the nice thing about having 3 people on, Jeff comes to me and says, hey, I know a guy who does a great Patton impression. I want to have him on the show. Fantastic, Jeff. I'll intro the show, turn it over to you. You start the interview. I'll jump in occasionally, but it's their guest. It's someone that maybe I don't know anything about. They have a great interest in them, especially when it comes to authors. Henry come, hey, I want to have so-and-so on. I've read 4 of his books, love his material, I've been talking to him. Fantastic. Start the show. What's the scuttlebutt, blah, blah, blah. Get all the stuff out of the way. Henry, who's our guest? Henry will, here's my guest, John McManus. These books. Henry will start asking questions. I'll listen and then hop in occasionally, and Jeff will. The only problem we have, and we're trying to come up with a way, and it's so hard to do because we're all remote. I'm in Florida. Henry's in Alabama. Jeff's in Texas, and there's a little bit of latency. And we do a really good job at it, but sometimes I feel like I'm talking over everybody, probably like I'm doing with you right now. It's just, that comes from radio, because in live radio, you can't have dead air. Dead air is the worst, because in radio, the fear is if there's a pause, someone's going to think you went off the air and changed the channel.
Yeah.
So the radio guy in me is, I don't like dead air, and so I'll put a pregnant pause to allow someone else to jump in. So we're trying to come up with a subtle visual cue, just to meaning, hey, I take a breath so I can jump in. So that's the one thing we're working on. And so by allowing them, or whoever, if I booked a guest, Jeff does, Henry does, by allowing them to start the interview or conduct the interview, it allows them to basically maintain it, and I just jump in on the side. But usually I end up talking over them anyhow.
Oh, that is so awesome. Well, the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast is such a great World War II podcast. You guys have had such amazing guests on, including myself. So, no, I'm just kidding.
Which will be coming on July 25th?
July 25th?
July 25th? Yeah, I got to look at the Google map.
I don't know. I gave you the last Thursday, the last Monday or whatever of the month to talk about the Indianapolis.
Yeah, it was the closest date we could come to the anniversary without stepping on a major holiday like 4th of July.
Yeah.
But yes, you'll be coming.
Yeah.
I'm trying to read the question. Somebody down here. The hardest thing I found reorganizing veterans, saying a spiel as he's given to others, breaking up the spiel with odd questions. That is a hard thing, whether it's with veterans or guests. Yeah. And I'm sure you've heard me do it. And I try to do it subtly. I'll try to stop the conversation because they'll say something I think has importance or something I don't want to follow up, but I see the conversation going away from that point, and so I kind of slow them down just so we can cover that point because I don't want to completely backtrack 2 miles, but they'll say something that's super important, and either I'll just let it go and forget it, depending on what they're currently talking about. If it's something I feel that could be interrupted without losing the severity of the topic, I'll kind of say, hold on real quick. I want you mentioned something I really think is important, and you kind of backtrack from there. Yeah. But yeah, it's just something you learn with time. Like I said, between my 3 podcasts, I'm probably close to, 800 episodes in, give or take. Mm-hmm. And so it just comes with time. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, this hour flew by super fast, Don. So, yeah. So I appreciate you coming on. Why don't you tell everybody where they can find you at, where they can find What's the Scuttlebutt and everything else?
Sure. If you want the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast, simply go to WTSPWorldWar2.com. We are on all the major platforms, iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, yada, yada, yada. But if you want to download the show directly, but more importantly, with every episode we do, like when we have you on, we create a page for that particular episode, and that's where you find the links to all the important stuff, to the Instagram pages, if they're an author, links to the Amazon pages, to their websites, but more importantly, photos. When you're listening to a podcast in an audible format, which is the way it's intended, you want to see who you're listening to. So you can go to WTSPWorldWar2.com, and you can see that patent impression, or you can see you or in your WAC uniform and things like that, and whatever we're discussing. We live stream on YouTube. So if you go to WTSPWorldWar2.com, or all of my podcasts are hosted. We have a general information page called d-410.com. That's d-410.com. That takes you to the link to not only my 3 podcasts, but I web host. I'm not the host of. I web host another podcast on our platform called the Tackle Your Personal Best podcast, which is a fishing podcast that two of my friends do that I host on our network. So I'm trying to build a podcast network kind of for people who want to get into podcasting but don't know the first thing about hosting, don't know how to get it out there. And so we have 4 podcasts on our network. I'm on 3 of them. Poor Mike, they want me to come on their fishing podcast more, but I'm like, I want a podcast on the network that I have nothing to do with, because I don't want people, oh, gee, how many podcasts does this guy need? No, I'll come on occasionally as a guest, but I want you guys to just be your thing. But anyhow, d-410.com, you can find links to all the podcasts, our YouTube channel, which is this Digital 410. We live stream every Monday and Tuesday. Tuesdays when we do What's in Your Head, and then occasionally we do the Fail to Fail. That's where you can find all my boring fishing content. Instagram, WTSP World War II. I'm trying to remember. I'm really bad at, none of my handles are the same across the platform. So I think on Facebook you have What's the Scuttlebutt on Facebook. You have I think D-Train is still my public profile on there. Instagram, I think I'm D-Train 410 or something along the lines, but clearly on Instagram you're seeing me now. And then on TikTok, I'm Donovan 410, but spelled out Fourten. And to be honest with you, I've been spending more time over there. It's not that I'm anti-Facebook or Instagram, but I have done this for so long that I got really jaded. When you have a profile on Facebook that has 5,000 subscribers, and you post a post, and you come back 2 hours the next day, and Facebook says, hey, good news, 30 people saw your post, but if you pay us $10, 200 people will see it.
Yeah, yep, I know.
And when you're on Instagram and you got, 1,000 followers, and you post something and 8 people see it, you're like, you put a stupid video with a UPS driver and a guy from Kentucky yelling profanities at each other for 38 seconds, you got 500,000 views, and it didn't cost you a dime. Yeah. So I've been kind of on TikTok more just because my content gets seen out there, and I don't have to pay for it to get seen.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Which I know I know you're trying to wrap it up, but just real quick, that's why the media tries to make Twitter so important, because Twitter doesn't charge them to get their content out. That's why when you watch news reports, it seems like the only people who use Twitter are people in the media and in Hollywood. Yeah. Because they don't have to pay to get their content out, whereas Facebook and Instagram you do.
Yeah, which that makes sense. Yeah.
So that's, by the way, you need to get yourself a TikTok channel going. So that's the way it's going.
I have a TikTok. I'm very bad at it. But I need to start using it more. Yeah, I'm very Instagram savvy, so that's why I've stuck to this platform for so long. I just started a YouTube channel, but the only thing it's all these episodes that I just upload there. I'm not a history traveler. I'm not like
that's
that.
That's what I do. To me, I'm not worried about trying to get everybody at one place so I can get monetization. I'm all about casting a wide net. All my YouTube content is also on Rumble or whatever that new platform's name is. I also upload it to a page called YouTube, which is the Utah Gun Exchange, which was launched when YouTube demonetized all the gun videos. And I'm on Twitch. I live stream to Twitter, even though I don't use it. I'm not trying to get everybody in one location so I can monetize. I want to get my content out to the different platforms, so regardless of where you're at or what your beliefs are, it's available to you. And shout out to Mr. Freddie Farnsworth. Not only has he been on your podcast, not only has he been on the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast, but he was nice. If you want Freddie and all his forum without talking about World War II, you got to listen to the episode of the What's in Your Head podcast he came on. We had a great time. Because I told him, I said, hey, after the What's Scuttlebutt, I said, hey, we had you on the show. We talked about Band of Brothers Pacific, but come on to What's in Your Head. We'll talk about Starship Troopers. We'll talk about all the other stuff. And so that allowed him to open up and talk about content that wasn't strictly Band of Brothers Pacific. And that was a great episode. We had a fun time with him. And so shout out to Freddie. I'm happy to see he's tuned in and watching us.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Don, let's go ahead and wrap it up. I got to let this pepper out. And So it has been so great talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on. Like, seriously, thank you so much. No worries.
Sorry if I ran off the mouth the whole time.
No, you're totally fine. So this was super great. I will post this. This will be available on YouTube tomorrow too as well. And then, Don, I'll chat at you later.
For your audience, head over to WTSP. We recently launched a new tab called Appearances. And on the Appearances page, you'll see our staff on other people's stuff. And so right now, there's 3 episodes of Henry Sledge on the World War II podcast, and there is the episode where Jeff was on your podcast linked to your YouTube channel.
Oh, cool. Oh,
and then obviously when you upload this to YouTube, this episode will also be on our WTSP appearances tab. So for those of you guys listening who didn't get to tune in and watch Jeff when he was on your show, you can obviously go to Sarah's YouTube channel and find it, or you can go to WTSPWorldWar2.com, click on appearances, and it's listed there as well.
That is great.
And this episode will be up in a few days.
All right,
and then obviously we will share this with our audience too. So our audience who's not here tonight will learn about your podcast, and hopefully we can send some traffic your way.
Thanks so much. You have a great night, okay?
Thank you. Have a good night.
Bye.